Mr. Speakers, let's widen this debate, because I think this debate should not only talk about new democracy, but all type of democracy. We think it's an unfair statement and an unfair setup coming from government, and we don't think there's a special needs and a special urgency to talk about this motion only in the context of a new democracy, but this motion should be talked within all type of democracy. So we're also talking about Indonesia, we're also talking about United States, we're also talking about Germany, because let's just respond. Because if the case, for examples, like this is only to new democratic country, therefore the main interest is for us to uphold the stability of democracy first. And I'm going to explain why, even within all of my response, are going to work for both types of democracy itself. The second clarification that we need in this debate is also to talk about what kind of extremism that we're talking about. We think the example of extremism that is brought by governments of the House is very minimum in this debate, because they only talk, for examples like OPM. And I would argue why that's not a good case, because in the case of OPM, for example, that's a case of special groups or political party that wants to go out from the democracy itself and want to form their own nation, in which we say they don't support and they don't contribute to the current democracy at all. That's why we think it's a separatist agenda, and that's why we think it's bad. But more importantly, we think the type of the idea of extremism that we're going to talk about should also talk about a wider spectrum. We should also talk about, for example, the rise of HTI that wants to establish khilafah in the country. We're going to talk about the establishment of right wing, for example, that hates immigrants, of people who hate, for example, in Indonesia that hate Chinese, or for example, or hate foreign people who they think is bad. So we think the debate should talk about all of that. So with that, we think the idea is clear. Now, what is the stance of opposition team? The stance of opposition is simple. First, we think what we agree is to support and to provide the basic human right or the basic democratic right of people. What are we talking about? We're talking about the freedom of expression and the right to vote as an individual, and also the right to form a community but without a formal political background. So it's okay for you to create your own group like FPI, for example. It's okay for you to have your own community, but only do that for your own collective agenda, but not for a political sphere. We think that this debate should also not talk about people being violent, because we think in any scenario, we're going to apply law enforcement either way to make sure that there are no violence and there are no criminal activities. Hence, what this debate should talk about. This debate should talk about what is the extent of democratic rights that we should give to people, especially when we're talking about a certain group of communities, and under what kind of reason we provide that to them. With that, I'm going to explain this in two things. First, I'm going to explain what is the idea of proper democracy that should be provided by the government and why it's enough. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what is the parameter of us when we are giving a formal political sphere to a certain group of people, and why extremists are not going to be able to provide this avenue itself. First, let's talk about what kind of the differences and what is the responsibility of democracy. As I previously told you, the responsibility of democracy is to provide basic democratic rights to everyone and to ensure that they will have all of the democratic rights for them to be able to express themselves for their own self. What I'm talking about is that the idea of freedom of speech should only matters to you as an individual, and the idea of freedom to vote also left to you as an individual. So that's why people, for example, like in Papua, can still vote, for example, and people, for example, like in FPI or any immigrant or any right wing, for example, can also still vote. Why? Because the right is only as an individual, and that's why we're okay with that. We think this will also neutralize the idea that came from governments at the House to say that they will feel not hurt at all, because they have already been fulfilled in their basic democratic rights itself. So that's why it will not be really that harmful to them, like their voice will not be unheard at all. They can simply badmouth the government all they want itself, or they can simply explain what is the thing that they think is good for them. But there's a difference, Mr. Speakers. We're talking that there's a difference between you hating government and when you want to create and initiate a group of makar. That is two different things. And we ban makar, for example, because it's an unfair attack to destroy the system itself. Hence, the conclusion should be that the responsibility is different from the government when the output is no longer yourself, but the output is society. Because the idea of freedom of speech is only for yourself, and the idea of freedom of vote is only for yourself. We're talking about a formal political sphere to create the idea of groups. It's different. Why? For example, there's a difference between you voting and you applying for president. You need, for example, you need to pass a fit and proper test. What kind of fit and proper test? For example, like you need to be checked if you're healthy, because if you are sick, you die soon, it will attack the stability of the country, and therefore we create a health and proper test to assume because when the output is no longer from yourself, the main idea should be stability itself. So that's why, for example, when the candidate is seen as mentally unfit and are feared to be irrational, they cannot pass the fit and improper test because they carry responsibilities to other people, because the output is no longer for yourself but also for the other society. Second thing is that they need to know the idea of UUD Pancasila, for example. They need to understand the core value of the country because they need to act within the value of the state. We argue that these extremist group, for example, we're talking about HTI, they want khilafah, they don't want democracy at all. They want Pancasila at all. It means that they would not act within the core principle of the government itself. So that's why we think that all of the second thing why we think it's bad is also because all of the extremist ideology are mostly a hate speech or an attack. For example, so we're talking about a right-wing attack on immigrants, attack to minority, attack on anti-Islam or anti-Chinese. Most of that are actually a hate speech and the idea of how you intimidate people. We think that bad-mouthing is bad. That's why we ban hate speech, we ban black campaign, and we ban money politic itself. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the idea of what is the parameter of formal political sphere. It's being done for you to be able to, first, you actually have to agree to be democratic first. That's why, because it's important for you to contribute to a better democracy. So that's why we think that extremists, for example, they doesn't want democracy. They want change of the system. When you're talking about HTI, what they want is khilafah. Khilafah is not democratic at all. When, for example, like when you want to have a right wing that have anti-immigrant, so they want every immigrant to be kicked out. We don't think also that's democratic at all. So that's why this interest in value itself is already contradicting to basic value of democracy. And as government, we told you that democracy is the most important value that you need to bring. Why? Because it's also because as a democracy, you have a representation to the state values, because you need to have a proper values and that are not being harmed. Some countries, for example, some political parties can translate it differently. For example, like the idea of good value of Pancasila between PKS and Democrat might be different, but they still value democracy as important. It's very different with extremists itself. But lastly, we think that most of these types are actually attacking and discriminate people that are vulnerable, that is part of society. We're talking about an attack of immigrant that is state-owned citizens. We're talking about the attack of racism toward, for example, like Chinese Indonesian who are part of Chinese of Indonesia, and we think this is really, really bad because this harms the stability of the country. As a position, we said that stability of the state and democracy is the most important. We don't think extremists cater to those. We're more than very proud to oppose. Thank you.